Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully you get sight of my slides and you can follow through. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you, and thanks very much for the invite to come along and talk to you about organisational culture. Thanks to Tony for the introduction. And the title of today's webinar is Culture is What People Do When No One Is Looking. So we've got a number of audience members. We've got people online. We've also got people in one of our Cardiff cohorts. So what I would ask, if you are online, it may be helpful for you to just take out your cameras because that will help with the bandwidth. And given that we've got a number of different audiences today, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by talking for about 5 minutes about the CAPE programme and why, from my perspective, I think organisational culture is so important. Okay, so we'll spend 5 minutes doing that, and then I'm going to talk about organisational culture generally, and then specifically within the context of the CAPE programme. So let's first of all, I've only got one slide to describe the CAPE programme and what it's all about and why it's so important that we take on board this idea of organisational culture. Now, many of you, particularly those of you that are in the room and are already on a cohort, will understand what the CAPE programme is all about. CAPE stands for the Circular Economy Innovation Communities, and it's really to address the problem that we can see on the left-hand side of this particular slide. You can see the cross there. We're doing far too much of that stuff. Yeah, we're taking stuff out of the ground, we're making stuff, we're using it, then we're disposing of it, and we're polluting the environment. And that's causing real problems, as I'm sure we all appreciate. And we need to move to a circular model that's described underneath with a big green tick. Yes, we will continue to use stuff, make stuff, but we need to be focusing far more on opportunities to remanufacture and to reuse. If we can't do that, then recycle. And that's really what we need to be thinking about in terms of what we're doing in our organisations. Circular economy, you know, what do we mean by it? Well, there's over 100 definitions, but the one that I like is, and this is a simple one, the circular economy is about keeping resources in use and avoiding waste. And that's really what we're all about. And what you can see there on this slide is some of the innovations that have been going on the CAPE programme thus far. And some of these pictures perhaps you recognise because you may actually be involved in some of these initiatives. We've got groups, for example, that are looking at medication that's used in the NHS in Wales. And there you can see a picture of an asthma medication, an inhaler. And for those of you that are not aware, the current aerosol-based treatments are very bad for the environment, and there are equally effective treatments available that are less harmful to the environment. And so, you know, we're looking really closely at opportunities to influence prescribing and move into treatments that are less harmful to the environment. We've also got groups, incidentally, that are looking at the plastic casings on the inhalers and looking at opportunities for recycling those. And that's really exciting, what's going on in health at the moment in terms of trying to hit net zero by 2030. Groups are being encouraged to think about opportunities for remanufacturing. And you can see there some examples. You've got an office chair that perhaps you've noticed there on the slide. And it's really trying to encourage our organisations through their procurement policies to think about remanufacturing the items that they're buying rather than purchasing them new. We're also encouraging participants and their organisations to think carefully about their procurement policy in terms of trying to get them think about opportunities to move from purchase to lease. And there you can see an MRI scanner, which is a classic example. And what happens, and this is really interesting, what happens if you move to a lease model, then a situation exists where the manufacturer retains ownership of that piece of equipment right through its life. And what that does is it encourages them to build in circularity into the design of that particular piece of equipment. So when it comes to decommissioning that MRI scanner, because it would have been designed in a way that it could be disassembled, many of the parts could be reused or remanufactured, and the manufacturer, of course, is incentivized to do that, to design it in that way, because they know that they're going to retain ownership. So all of these exciting things are going on currently on the CAPE programme. You can see a picture there of people that are working hard to innovate a new process. You know, many of our groups are looking at existing processes and procedures and thinking about how they can embrace circular economy principles in those systems and procedures that they've got currently in place. How can they produce a similar outcome but using less resources? So it's not just about product innovation, it's about process innovation as well. So all of these things are going on in the CAPE programme. But this is the point. It does really require, for this to happen, it does really require a paradigm shift. Now, we've all heard that term, haven't we? Paradigm shift. And we probably all thought, what on earth does that mean? And I'd like us to think about that a little bit this morning. For those amongst us that are linguists, that like the language, the word paradigm comes from the Greek, and it means pattern. Now, patterns are something that I think are very interesting within organisations. And here, when we think about organisational culture, I'd like us to think about patterns. I'd like us to think about the taken for granted assumptions that are held in common within your organisation. Not taken for granted assumptions that are held, that individuals have, but that are held in common. And I'd like us to think carefully about that, because what tends to happen when we get a situation where we've got these taken for granted assumptions that are held in common, then they are translated into patterns of behaviour that become, quote, the way we do things around here. Yeah. And that's really the transition that I'd like us to think about between what I've been talking about, the kinds of challenges that we're all very keen to get involved in, and making it happen within our organisations. Yeah, we've got to change patterns of behaviour. Yeah, that's what really we've got to do. Change patterns of behaviour. I was reading something quite recently that was about the NHS, and this individual that was particularly insightful was talking about the challenges in terms of net zero and sustainability, and they were saying it's about 10,000 and more little decisions that are made every day by the staff and the people that work within the NHS. This is fundamentally about changing those patterns of behaviour. And I think that's really, really useful for us to think about that in those terms. It's not easy to do because the existing patterns of behaviour perhaps have been in place for decades, even centuries. And we're coming along as champions of this agenda and saying we'd like you to change. And it's not easy. Okay. So that's the first thing that I'd like us to think about as we move forward and talk about organisational culture this morning. Yeah, culture is what people do when no one is looking. And how many of us, even when it comes to recycling, do we always do the right thing? Or if no one's looking, perhaps we lapse into bad behaviour. More and more, I think, our consciences get pricked when we do the wrong thing, but we want to create an organisational culture where doing the right thing becomes natural, becomes part of the way we do things, part of our organisational culture, and this really is the challenge, I think. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of organisational culture, because it's really quite interesting. You know, going back 40 or 50 years, organisational culture was the kind of subject that was taught in universities, that academics were interested in. But as far as hard-nosed business people that worked in organisations, it didn't really have a lot of traction. And what's really interesting, and indulge me for a few moments, is how all of that changed. And one of the things that happened during the 1970s and the 1980s, and I'm looking around the room, well, some of us, I'm sure, can remember those times. One of the things that was a characteristic of those times was the success of Japanese industry. We perhaps remember it, you know, the electronics companies like Sony and Panasonic, and the automotive companies like Toyota and Honda and Nissan. It used to be called Datsun, didn't it? You know, the Japanese were obviously doing something right, and many executives in the United States and in the UK and other countries packed up their briefcases. They went off to Japan. They took copious notes as to how they did things, and then they came back to their home countries and they tried to implement those techniques. And for those of us that were involved in organisational development in the 1980s and the 1990s, we probably remember the huge focus on those techniques like total quality management and quality circles and things like that. But you never guess what? Those techniques didn't work quite as well in Western environments. And in hindsight, what people realized was that the success of Japanese industry was underpinned by certain things that were present in Japanese culture generally, that wasn't present in our own. And so people started to think about culture and organisational culture and how it contributed to organisational success. People started to sit up and take notice how important this aspect was, both in the private sector and in the public sector. So the Japanese experience was something that sparked people's imaginations about organisational culture. That was one thing that changed. The other thing that changed, I think, and this is my personal opinion, what I'm describing here, is there was a very famous book that was published in 1982, and I've got on the slide you can see the book. It was entitled In Search of Excellence by Peters and Waterman, and it was a bestseller. Tom Peters, who was a Stanford student and then worked for McKinsey, one of the big American consultancy firms, he published this book. And In Search of Excellence, essentially what it was is he was looking at what he described as excellent organizations. And you can probably kind of guess where he's going with it, because if you can identify the common characteristics of excellent organizations, excellent companies, then you can almost provide a prescription for success. In that research that was carried out, one of the things that emerged was the importance of people, productivity through people. When they interviewed the people that worked for these organizations, they picked up that employees all had a shared sense of purpose. They understood what the organization was trying to achieve. They appreciated how they fitted into that. And they had a vested interest in the success of the organization. And so I believe, and I think many other people do, that this was very much a turning point where organizations started to sit up and take notice of how important organizational culture actually is. Now, I told you I was going to tell you a little bit of a history lesson, but let's go back even further. I know some of you will know who this is, but if you do, by the way, pop it in the chat. I know Gary knows who he is, but we're going even further back in history here. And this character, who actually is Machiavelli, so we're bang up to date now, aren't we? Who lived from 1469 to 1527. He said something which I think is as true today as it was then. And I'm going to read it out. And maybe as I read it, you can perhaps think about your own organizations and how difficult it is sometimes to change things, particularly large organizations. This is what he said. He said, there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. And Machiavelli penned those words all those centuries ago. And when I read them, I often think about our large organizations that suffer from what has been termed organizational rigidity, the propensity of organizations not to want to change. And this is something which I think is a major challenge. And not least because our existing ways of doing things are entrenched in our organizations. Now, our next slide tells you where I got the title of today's session from. Culture is what people do when no one is looking. It's from Herb Kelleher, who was the chairman of Southwest Airlines. And not only was he the chairman, he of course was the co-founder in the early 1970s. Highly successful airline in the United States. Was very much a forerunner, I think, of a lot of the budget airlines that we see today, but was renowned for its exceptional service that it provided to its customers. And I thought this quotation from Herb Keller was really telling, because he's got it spot on, hasn't he? That culture is what people do when no one is looking. Because as organizations, we often create a veneer that is public facing, that perhaps presents us in a certain way that is positive, that accepts all the things around climate change and what we need to do as an organization to move in that direction. We'll write countless strategies and plans to set out what we're going to do. And then when no one's looking, we actually do things that take us in the opposite direction, or at least don't align with those things, you know. So I think that's something that we need to think about and challenge ourselves and our organizations. In fact, the model that's often used to describe organizational culture, and we can think about it as a model, or we could think about it as a metaphor, is the iceberg that you can see there. That's a kind of veneer, isn't it, that you can see from the outside, or in this case, above the waterline. But we know that one of the characteristics of icebergs is that there is so much that sits below the waterline that is unseen unless you're actually within that organization and work within it and understand it. And I think organizational culture is a little bit like that, that from the outside, sometimes it's difficult to appreciate what's going on and what the challenges are. We've gone from Herb Keller to another quote from a famous guru. And again, I'm hoping that some of you guys can relate to this, because some of you may be involved in the preparation of organizational strategies around net zero and trying to put in place all the things that we need to. And what Peter Drucker said famously was that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what he means by that is that organizations can develop the best strategies in the world and articulate them in a way that everybody understands, that everybody can sign up to, at least on the surface. And yet, having done that, unless you've got an organizational culture that is aligned to it, then you can forget it. It won't succeed. And so it's quite clear, to me at least, that if our efforts are to be successful, if we are to achieve our ambition, then we need to think about organizational culture and how we can do everything we can to ensure that it is aligned with our ambition and the initiatives that we want to put in place. And what I'd like us to do just in the next 10 minutes is to think about a tool that could help us achieve that. So for those of you that are in the room, I know that Jill is going to be asking you to do an exercise after this short session. As I'm going through it, I'd like you to perhaps take some notes where you can, so if you think of opportunities that exist within your own organization, as I'm going through this model, then please jot them down so that when you do this exercise in a little while, you can bring those ideas to the table. So the model that I want us to explore for the next sort of 10 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A, is the cultural web. Okay, now you can see it on the screen there. It's a Johnson and Scholes model. It's an academic model, but we're hopefully going to apply it to practice, to get you to think about the model, but also about applying the model to your own organization and think about the culture. You remember we started off earlier on talking about, everything that's going on and the need for a paradigm shift. And we said that the paradigm was about those taken for granted assumptions that are ingrained almost in the organization, and they need a shift. And there in the center of the model, you can see the paradigm. And that's what that is, really. It's the taken for granted assumptions that are held in common, by the people that work in the organization, about what's important, things like values and beliefs and those kinds of things. And what Johnson and Scholes say is it's quite difficult to change that, at least directly. But in this model, what they present to us is opportunities to perhaps make some impact in shifting the organizational culture in the direction that we want it to move. And you can see around the periphery of this model all these weird and wonderful things: stories and symbols and rituals and routines, power structures, organizational structures, control systems. All of these things, according to Johnson and Scholes, are the outward manifestations of culture. Because culture, when you think about it, it's something that's quite intangible, isn't it? When I talk to my MSc students that are studying strategic accounting, most of them are training to be professional accountants. When they look at an organization, they look at the financial statements, something quite concrete and tangible about those, isn't it? But when I talk to them about organizational culture, they think, well, how on earth do you profile? How on earth do you assess an organization's culture? Well, this is a model that helps us do that. Yeah. And you can imagine yourselves, think about yourselves as consultants going into your organization and thinking about, well, what is this culture? And this model is all about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go round the chart and I'm going to talk to you about each element. And whilst I'm doing that, I want you to note down opportunities that spring to your mind that you could actually put in place in your organizations. Okay, so let's go around the chart, and what I've done in this slide, you can see I've added some notes that hopefully will be helpful. Well, let's start with symbols. And what are symbols? Well, symbols can be pretty much anything. Yeah, you can see on the chart they can be objects, events, acts, or people that convey, maintain, or create meaning over and above their functional purpose. And as I'm reading that, I'm imagining you probably thinking, what gobbledygook is that? But sometimes it's better to give you some examples of the kinds of things that I mean. And let me give you one little example. It's from my own personal experience. When I first started in education and I went to the interview, I was sat outside the principal's room. And I don't know whether any of you guys have been to an interview. It's usually a little bit nerve-wracking, isn't it? You want to get the job. and I was on a sofa outside the principal's office, and on his door there was a plaque that said principal's office. Nothing unusual about that, you may think, but next to it was another door, and it had another plaque on it. And I'd like you to think about what that plaque could possibly say. I've asked this question many times, and people in the room have said principal secretary, vice principal, lots of examples of possible answers to that question usually emerge. And generally speaking, they're all incorrect. But what this plaque said on the door next to the principal was principal's toilet. And I was quite surprised at that. Even 25 years ago, principal's toilet, I thought, that's really odd. And even though I didn't think about it at that time, that was a very powerful symbol to me that spoke to me subliminally about the culture in that organization. You know, it was the principal's toilet. Nobody was allowed to go in there, you know. It was a powerful symbol, you know. And then when I finished the interview, I went out of the car into the car park, and there was a car parking space, and there was another plaque on the car parking space, and you're probably ahead of me here. It said principal's car parking space, you know. And again, it was a powerful symbol, wasn't it? It reinforced hierarchy. I guess it said that this was an organization where this individual was in charge. They had their own toilet. They had their own car parking space that was a little bit wider than everybody else's. And, you know, everybody knew what that meant, you know. So symbols can be anything. They can be job titles, you know. I'm an assistant director, or I'm a director. Yeah, yeah. Offices can be symbols. Yeah, they have a functional purpose, yes, but they're highly symbolic. If you've got your own office, or an office in a particular location, or of a certain size, you know, car parking privileges, all these things can be symbolic, can't they? There was one chief executive, and this is really interesting, that when they took up post, they decided to unscrew the door of their office that had their plaque on it, you know, their name and their title, and he instructed the accommodation people to take it off his office and to hang it up in reception. So when the people that worked in that organization came in on a Monday morning, they noticed something above them, and they all peered up, and they thought, what on earth is that? And when they looked closely, they saw that it was the door off the office of the new chief executive. And you think, well, what has he done that? Why has he done that? Well, he did it to create a symbol. And you're probably guessing what he was trying to communicate. He was trying to say, my door is open. Please come and talk to me. I'm the new chief executive. I'm interested in your views. So please, my door is open. And it was something that was really powerful. And I'd like you to think about what symbols that you can put in place that will signal to people what's important in your organization as far as this agenda is concerned. Okay? Are there any symbols that you can create? What about stories? That's another one, isn't it? Now, stories can be about I'm on the slide here, can be about heroes or villains. They can be about great successes, or they could be about catastrophic failures. But the important thing to remember is that stories in this context, they reside in the collective memory of the organization and are perpetuated over time. They're the kinds of things that perhaps are told to new recruits that come into the organisation. They literally can be anything. Now, here's the wonderful thing, that stories like symbols can be created. So if you've got people in your organisation that are doing positive things relating to the circular economy, relating to our ambitions to achieve net zero, then let's publish those stories internally. Let's try to make those part of the narrative, so that when people read about positive behaviours, they will think, well, you know, maybe this is something that I could do as well, because clearly the organisation is responding well to these behaviours. Yeah. So think about what stories can be published internally and externally in order to shift that narrative. What about rituals and routines? These are things that we do day in, day out in our organizations. What are they? You know, which of them are embedded in history? What we've always done it this way. What assumptions and core beliefs do they reflect? What do training programs emphasize? How easy are they to change? You know, there's a piece of work, isn't it? What do we do ritualistically, routinely in our businesses, in our organizations, in the departments that we work in? And what does that say about the culture of the organization? Are there any things that we could change in order to stimulate interest, shift behavior, create patterns of behavior that become the way we do things around here? What about control systems? We've all got them in our organizations. Yeah. What is most closely monitored or controlled? Is emphasis on reward or punishment? Are controls rooted in history or in our current strategies? Are there many or few controls? What are the control systems? And think about control systems, holistically. They start at the top in terms of our strategic plans, the strategic priorities that are set out by our organizations. So if you work for NHS Wales, for instance, you've got an NHS Wales decarbonisation strategy. That's a control system. Hopefully that's then reflected in departmental objectives and individual objectives. So those control systems operate at the apex, but also should disseminate right through the organisation. It's what Peter Drucker said, isn't it, once? What gets measured gets done. And again, control systems and performance measures, because performance measures are part of those control systems, send very powerful messages into the business or into the organization as to what's important. Even down to our appraisal systems, where we appraise our staff on a regular basis and determine whether or not they've achieved their objectives. Yeah. So from the apex right down to an individual level, what are our control systems encouraging in terms of behaviors? Yeah. Do we have budgetary control systems that encourage waste? If you're a manager and you've got £100,000 a year budget and it's coming to the end of the financial year and you've got a month left, what do? Do you put a memo out? Memo shows my age. Do you put an email out that says to your staff, does anybody need anything? Does the kitchen need a new microwave? Anybody need any new IT equipment? Why do we do that? Well, we do it because traditional budgetary control systems are designed that if you don't use your budget, it's taken off you. So do we need to think carefully about those systems and move to a zero-based budgeting model? Okay, so I don't know what your control systems are, but whatever they are, they need to be carefully evaluated to see whether they are encouraging good behaviours or bad behaviours. What about our procurement policy? Is it sufficiently weighted to take account of our ambitions around net zero? We've got lots of groups looking at that at the moment, you know. What about our organisational structures? Yeah, do we have people that have got responsibilities around net zero? Have we thought about putting responsibilities into everybody's job description so that everybody has got a responsibility to themselves, to the organisation, to society, to future generations in terms of this particular agenda? And who's got the power in your organisation? And are they exercising it in a way that reflects our ambition here in terms of the circular economy and net zero? So can you see how, you know, this model is very, very useful? It enables you to go to your organisation and to profile your existing organisational culture, and then to say, well, what can we do in order to shift that in the direction we need to shift it in order to realise our ambition? Yeah. So the cultural web, useful model. And hopefully after this particular webinar, which is scheduled to finish at 12, you will have opportunity, I think that's Jill's plan, to think about how you could potentially utilize this within your own organizational contexts. Okay. Now then, I'm not going to say much more other than I'm going to invite some questions or comments or initial thoughts, either for those of you that are online or alternatively in the room. You can use the chat bar if you're online. I can't see the chat bar, so I'm guessing that Laura can probably see a chat bar. So if there are any questions or comments, then now is the time to sort of to put them forward. And you know, go on, Jill, anything from the room?
I'm just unmuting. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay. Any thoughts?
Got any questions? You get a round of applause from here.
Well, I didn't hear that. It wasn't loud enough.
Oh, you missed the round of applause.
I missed it.
We'll do it again, Andrew.
Oh, there you are then. Go on. Yeah. Excellent. Good.
Okay, are there any questions from the room first?
Or comments, indeed. Any thoughts that you might that have occurred to you?
Well, they've all gone quiet, Andrew. What have you done to my cohort? No? Anything in the chat, Laura? Nothing in the chat either.
Wow. Well, we've got something here. Let me just see if I can. There's something I just spotted in the chat. Let me see if I can bring the chat up.
Callum Shaw's got his hand raised, Andrew, on the webinar.
Okay,
you can
Callum.
just unmute Callum and ask your question.
Yeah, go for it, Callum.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, Andrew, thanks for that sort of presentation. I found it really useful. One of the things, which is probably a comment and a bit of a question to go along with it, but it's something sort of I'm struggling with. So I work for Cardiff and Vale University Health Board, but this is sort of one of the things, and that paradigm shift is which you touched upon within your presentation, is one of the things I'm sort of struggling to sort of embed, because we've got parts of that process in there and we've probably got the right people, but really getting the whole organization to change is probably one of the most difficult things. I always sort of say that behavior change is one of the most difficult things we can sort of implement across the organization. It seems to be part of everything I want to do in my role. But it just sort of be interesting to sort of hear your wider thoughts around how you can really ingrain that within an organization.
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and I think where you've got a fantastic start point is that there are a number of strategic plans that NHS Wales have produced, and I'm sure you're very familiar with them. I mentioned in the presentation the NHS Wales decarbonisation strategy, and there is no doubt that that will then be reflected in your organisational strategy. I'm sure it will have been adopted or certainly reflected. And that gives you a fantastic mandate, doesn't it, to then take that further down into your organisation, to link it to departmental objectives, the metrics that you put in place, the KPIs, make sure that the measures that are put in place, the targets that are put in place, really reflect that ambition, and take that right down to the organisation. I was talking about things like individual sort of appraisals, make it part of people's job descriptions. We did it years ago with health and safety. We made health and safety everybody's responsibility, so we put it in everybody's job description. Well, here's an opportunity really to kind of push that down, and that's what I would encourage you to do at every opportunity, and I think that will help it to become embedded. Does that help? Or
it does in part. Jill will know I'm a bit more difficult than most people, so sorry for coming back. But I guess you mentioned the NWSSP strategic delivery plan. I kind of see that as a symbol of hierarchy, and
right.
it's a way in which maybe it doesn't disseminate across organisations sufficiently. Really, is that that blanket for all the targets which are set within NWSSP strategic delivery plan, like these are what everyone should do, but the challenges facing each individual organisation are very different. So that's kind of when you were talking about the symbols and the power structures, I found, and the organisational, well, pretty much the whole sort of cultural web around this is that setting targets at a level above the organisational sort of structure is what's quite interesting about the delivery of that system and that change within the decarbonisation parameters.
Yeah, and maybe that is reflective of timescales. I mean, to set a target in terms of 2030, it is very, very ambitious. So perhaps that very directional approach may be, part and parcel of the time frame. But I think the opportunity with programs like CAKE is to be, not for it just to be top down, but for it to be bottom up as well. So we've got lots of examples of challenge groups within CAKE that are doing quite remarkable things and are actually influencing things from the bottom up. So I think we can do what we can do, but certainly take on board your point there.
Callum, we'll be picking it up next in our next cohort day, Callum, as well.
Okay, thanks.
Callum, I'll tell you what's interesting with the cultural web framework. It gives you a chance, because everything appears macro, doesn't it? That it's, we've got these big challenges going on. But within the elements of the framework, as you said, the stories, the symbols, etc., it gives you a chance to break it down, I think, into manageable pieces rather than look at it as a whole, you know. And even within those individual elements of what stories are going to change this, what structures are going to change this, it gives you a chance to sort of approach those in a micro way. And all of those increments are really important, you know. Sometimes you get lost thinking, oh, how are we going to make this happen? It's far too big a job. But what it does, it gives you a chance to sort of, what the old time management guys used to say is, break the elephant down into biteable chunks.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Yeah,
absolutely, Tony. Thanks for that.
I'm just going to question there. There's another question there, Andrew, from, was it Serena? Serena's got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, thank you. I'm Serena. I'm Executive Director of Operations at Coastal Housing, a housing association. I mean, it's been fascinating, and I just give a bit of kudos to Adam West, our research manager, who invited me along to this. So thanks for that prompt, because I really, really valued this, and I loved breaking down culture into those elements, because you're right, it is intangible. It's hard to put into words. So I think that breaking it down has been incredibly helpful. The challenge from Coastal's perspective, as I see it, is, so we've been a systems thinking organisation for 15 plus years. We use the Vanguard method of systems thinking for continuous improvement, and that has largely shaped our culture, decentralising decision making. You know, we don't use targets, we don't use appraisals, we don't write lots of policies and strategies that sit on shelves. We're very much in the work, changing the work incrementally, day in, day out. But it takes it through using this method, but it takes time, and it takes trust, and it takes exposing people to normative experiences in order to be able to get through that. So we've got to do so. Our challenge now is that the climate emergency is so great that there isn't enough time to take people with us on a kind of largely kind of gentle, not gentle, but a kind of longer term program of helping them realize, winning the hearts and minds, helping people realize that they need to make decisions in the work, and actually need to move to a possibly more top-down imposed position, in the opposite place to the previous conversation. So, and as a custodian of our culture, and our culture works incredibly well, there's quite a dilemma for me as a leader in that space about how do I impress the climate emergency and the change that we build houses every year. We've got 6,000 properties. We know the contribution that we're making to that climate crisis, and how do I, as a leader in that space, make sure that I am guarding the things of the culture that make us brilliant and not destroying those, and galvanize people towards a very urgent and immediate threat. So if you could answer that on a postcard, I'd be delighted.
Well,
thanks.
I'll just go forward. I'll just answer that now. Just take a few minutes. No, I think you make some really good points there, and I think there is a link between what you just said and the previous. I can't remember who it was. It was Callum, wasn't it? In terms of maybe that top-down approach, it has been put in place because of the time frame here. But I think what's interesting is what you were saying in terms of climate emergency, and we need to move very quickly. And I think you said it's very difficult to take people along with you because we've got to move fast. And I think what sprung to my mind was that often we can raise people's dissatisfaction with the status quo, because sometimes people need the information in order to think to themselves, well, we just can't continue on in the way that we're doing things. So I think there is a case, and you've got to think about this carefully. There is a case of trying to raise dissatisfaction with the status quo by sending those very powerful messages about what needs to be done and needs to be done quickly. I think there is still a case that people should be involved in the process, because if you involve people in the process, then they become more committed to it. But certainly take on board what you're saying, and maybe timescale is a big factor here in terms of what we want to achieve in a short period. But thanks for that, those comments, Serena.
And can I just jump in again there? Sorry, I've always got something to say, haven't I? One of the things there, Serena, I think is, and we discussed this in the early cohorts, and I've sort of tried to include it in later ones as well, is I think it was an academic called Adler who identified this adoption curve quite early on. And basically what you've got to get is a sort of, and it's in the press a lot now, tipping point. So you've got to get enough people interested. So those early adopters in your organization, the ones that you know will be on side, they understand what climate change is about. What can they do to influence, to create that majority? You know, and it isn't easy. You're right. It isn't easy. But the shift towards a big change, the likes of Apple and Microsoft, etc., they know how to get a buy-in to an early to a majority. You know, and that's what you've got to work towards. There's a curve there, isn't there?
That's great. Thanks both. Much appreciated.
That's great. Thanks, Tony. I was going to just going back to the previous question. I think it was Callum. I was just speaking to somebody very recently, and it was in an NHS context, and it was in the context of services being cut, and only 9 months previous, a cluster in the Swansea area had won an NHS award. I think that was instrumental in getting that decision reversed. That service wasn't cut. Anyway, my point, and I'm rambling on a little bit, that sometimes bottom up initiatives that are fantastic, that are published widely, that get recognition across the patch, often can influence senior executives within our organizations to move in a direction that perhaps we have struggled to get them move in the past. So I think, yes, top down we see a lot of it because of the time frame, but bottom up as well. Don't underestimate the potential of that. Okay, now I'm just,
Andrew, there was a comment in the chat if everybody wants to see it from Chris Long. I know we're short of time now because we're finishing.
Yes, what was that, Jill?
Aware of time, all of our staff have sustainability in their job description. We have carbon task group representative from state senior team, so they're in terms of what they're doing. So they've put it in the chat as to what they're what Chris Long's organisation.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. And that kind of reinforces, doesn't it, the what you can do in order to formalise those I guess those responsibilities, but make it clear that this is something that the organisation sees as important, and it's positive behaviours that they want to encourage. And I think then long term that certainly will become part of the organisational culture for sure. Okay, I've popped up on the screen some other events that are coming up quite soon that I've been asked to make you aware of. Fantastic event on the 15th, looking at implementing innovative technologies into the NHS. And then we've got something that's quite intriguing on the 26th of April, Welsh seaweed, more than just lava bread, which is going to be really, really interesting. And the other thing that I just want to mention, I know I'm just a minute over 12 o'clock, is our Cake Spring Conference 2023, 24th of March in the Swansea.com Stadium, which of course is the old Liberty Stadium in Swansea. Please join up and come along. We've got quite a large number coming along, and still, I don't know whether we still got some stalls available. We've got about 20 or 30 stalls as well. So if your organisation want to put a stall in there, then I think that there's still some opportunities for that. Okay, right. Well, that's me done. It's 2 minutes past 12. Thank you all for your attendance and your engagement. It's been very much appreciated, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon at some point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. And
okay.
Thank you, Andrew.
Cheers. Bye.